So today you got two handouts. You got your exercise 110, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and you also got your assignment 103 handout, which is the next in your series of assignments. For this assignment, you're going to be creating an 11 by 17 poster of the architectural lecture series. And so, for example, right, every semester the ACE Club, along with Daniel, puts together a lecture series that you guys can go to. And every year they do a poster that will show up eventually, and also these little cards that come out so that people can see who's speaking, and it's kind of advertising. You're going to do something very similar to this, creating your own graphics, your own layout, etc. It needs to be 11 by 17. It's not designed to be a postcard format like this, where you have two sides, just one-sided, and it would go like on a wall and advertise who's coming to speak. You're more than welcome to use this lecture series or last lecture series in terms of who's coming to speak and what dates they're coming. You can also make up your own lecture series. So you can have people come that you'd like to hear speak. They don't have to be alive. You can have people from the past come and speak. It's entirely up to you. The point is you can make up who's coming if you want to do that. Otherwise, you're more than welcome to use who's already coming as part of it. Your work is due on the 8th of March, which is a Wednesday. You'll need to post it, and you'll also need to give me an 11 by 17 print of your poster. So this is sounding familiar, right? Each time I've asked you to do it. Please make sure that this one is in color, not in black and white. I know that there's always printer issues that day. I've never had printer issues with the 11 by 17 prints. They seem to always come out fine. It's usually the 8.5 by 11s that have issues. So anyway, you'll turn those in, you'll do comments on it, etc. There is more to InDesign and kind of getting through layout work and whatever. You're not quite there yet, though after today with typography, you'll be a little bit better off toward this. So anyway, we'll continue with typography today, and then we'll get into some more advanced layout techniques that you'll probably want to use as part of your assignment as well. So today we're going to talk through typography, which is essentially fonts, types, typefaces, etc. In order to adequately talk about it, we have to go over some terms so that when we're talking about kerning or tracking, you have some clue what I'm talking about. But this is something that I would say is probably absolutely fundamental building block to any graphic design, is what font you're using, what size is the font. It really controls a lot about what you're creating as a product. It also is something that is always overlooked when we're doing architectural board presentations. When we print the big posters that go on the wall for the final review, type always comes at the end, and it's always ugly. And so the idea behind talking about something like this is to try to get you to learn to make it attractive and to make it good. So we'll start with style. This is probably something you're already very familiar with, and that is that we have a regular, we have an italicized version, and we have a bold version of any particular font. They're generally used to provide some kind of contrast or emphasis on a particular piece. Generally speaking, if you can choose from within the font family rather than the operating system, you'll have better results. And I'll tell you what I mean in just a second. So here we are. We've got hazy written across the screen here. And in this context, each version is created by the operating system. So we have the regular standard version, the regular version. Then we have the italicized version, which essentially is taking the regular version and kind of slanting it a little bit. Okay, it's italicized, it works. We have a bold version here, kind of hard to tell. It looks very similar to the regular version. And we have a bold italicized version there as well. If we jump forward, this is what's within the font family. And I want you to compare each of these. So these would be the same because they're both the regular version of the font, nothing fancy. But if we look at the italicized versions here and here, the operating system version, this one, just slants the letters over. It just takes the regular standard letters and just slants them over a little bit. If we look at the italicized version that's designed in the font family, look at the tail of the Z. Look at the Y. Those things are adjusted and are actually designed in place. This italicized version looks a whole lot better than that version there. And that's selecting within the font family. So when we go to the drop down of the fonts, and you'll see this in InDesign today, instead of just saying, Control I, make italicized, which is what a lot of people do, instead you'll go into the font, you'll say I want Helvetica New Italics Bold or whatever, and it'll be listed as one of the separate fonts. It can make a big difference. If we look at the bold version right here, right, it's far more bold and really stands out compared to the OS version, and likewise the bold italic version obviously is better as well. Turn that off. We don't need sound. Hold on. There. Down here we've got another example of the operating system version where we just slant the letters over versus a true italicized font design version, far more attractive in its true italicized form. So by emphasizing this, I just want you to select this rather than the traditional Control I or operating system version, because you'll get far better results. Weight is the relative lightness or darkness of the letter forms marked by changes in stroke or line weight. So we have a light font, very thin. We have a regular medium font, rather standard, and we have a bold font. And if you notice on each of these, as we look down here, if we were just to look at the actual letters themselves, the L, for example, it's very, very thin. So the line is thin. That's the weight. The medium is a little bit thicker there, and the bold is the thickest. So we're just controlling how thick the lines that make up the font. It has nothing to do with the shapes of the letter forms. It's just the thickness of the lines that make up the fonts. So here we go. A set from thin, extra light, light, regular, medium, semi-bold, bold, black, and super. So you can see going from 100 all the way up to 900 in terms of how thick they get. The best fonts that are out here will have lots of versions. So Helvetica New, for example, is a great font because it has so many different versions of it. And depending on what you're trying to design, one of these versions can work really, really nicely. Width refers to different variations within a typeface family. You might have a condensed or a compressed font, and you might have an extended font. You may have played around with the extended font when you wanted your English paper to get a little bit longer. Let me use that. This is like a high school trick, right? Let me use that extended font. Well, guess what? People that teach know what the extended fonts are, and it's pretty obvious. So it doesn't really help you out too much. I guess you guys could have been really good and you could have used the compressed font to try it because you wrote so much you had to get it squeezed down. I doubt it. X height refers to the height of a lowercase x. It basically refers to the height of lowercase letters without tails. Right? Ascenders and descenders are the tails that happen. So it's the height of an x, essentially. Height of a lowercase a would be another example. It's easiest to just look at what an x is. Cap height is the height of a capital letter. So we have x height for the lowercase letter. We have cap height for the capital letter. And it's measured from the baseline to the cap line. And I'll have a graphic in just a second that'll show both of those. X height and cap height vary by typeface. And if, for example, we wanted to use two different typefaces, we would want to pay attention to the x height and the cap height to make sure that they were compatible. And I'll show you some compatibility things a little bit later on. So let's look here. This is that graphic form that I was talking about. So we have our capital letter that extends to the cap height there from the baseline there. Our x height here goes from the bottom of the x to the top of the x. So right there is our x height. Then we have our typical descenders, the p's and the g's. Those go down to a descender height. And we have an ascender height, which are things like h's, right, where we have the tops of the letters going up. And they would be, depending on the font, they could be a little bit taller than the cap height, or they could be identical to the cap height. It depends on the font designer as to whether they're a little bit taller or not. Counters are essentially white space that's located in and around letter forms. They affect legibility and readability and or density of a particular font. Thin fonts at big typefaces have open counters which can make them difficult to read. The alternative is true as well if we have a bold heavy font and it's really small, it's hard to read because there's not a lot of counter. There's not a lot of open space around the letters. So let's see an example. If we look at errors in its large form in a thin font, there's a lot of space around them, and we have to kind of concentrate. They start to become just shapes, not letters. And so there's a lot of space around them. The alternative, when we have errors when it's really small, and again, this is projected so it ends up being fairly big on the board. I should make it even smaller. When we look at it, the counters are very closed, and there's not a lot of space around them, so it's hard to distinguish the individual letters. It's much harder to read. So we just want to be aware as we use it. Small capitals are complete sets of uppercase letters that are the X height. So we use these, and a lot of times you see them on like the spine of a book or something like that, when we don't want to provide extra emphasis for a particular acronym or something that's within the flow of the text. So we use it to keep the letters small rather than really big letters. Lining and non-lining figures. So by figures, I mean numbers. And in font terms, figures are called, or numbers are called figures. It would be a whole lot easier if we just called them numbers. So we could say lining and non-lining numbers. This is very similar to cap height or small caps, because if we use, and I'll show you an example on the next slide, if we use full height numbers, right, so lining figures, the numbers will appear too big in a text. If we use non-lining, they basically use ascenders and descenders, and it flows much better as part of the text. So let's look at the actual example. It's much easier to see it this way. We have lining numerals. Those are the same as the cap height up at the top. We have non-lining numerals. You see the 3 has a descender. The 6 has an ascender. It goes up. And what happens when we read in a paragraph, so I know this is not as easy to see. Look here, right, at the $15. It stands out. The 32% right there stands out. It's really big. If you look across at 15 and 32, it reads into the flow of the text. You guys see how that works? So by using these non-lining figures in a paragraph format, we can make the text flow and we don't get stuck on the $10.50 or $15, right? The 1,476 minutes. This reads as part of the text, the 1,476. So it's just a different way of working. It can be challenging if you're doing headlines or a poster, say something like this, where we have the dates on the back. If we use the non-lining numerals in that, we have much less control. Suddenly the 6 is high and the 3 descends down and it gets awkward because that's in a heading format. In a paragraph format, using these non-lining numerals can really make a big difference in terms of the readability. This is probably something you never noticed before, right? Ligatures are specially designed characters that happen when we collide letters together. They replace the colliding letters. And this is really blatantly obvious if you take a second and you look at, hold on a second. If you look at how we would naturally write. So if I was writing my son's name, which is Bennett, I would naturally cross both T's as I write. I wouldn't, write. That would be really awkward. You guys see how that works? Right? If I wanted to type figures, right, chances are I would just, I know my writing on this is not the best, but I wouldn't dot the I because the top of the F becomes the I. So this is just natural. You just do it. You don't think about it. Fonts have a way of substituting these same kinds of figures or these same kinds of combinations as ligatures. So if we look here in this upper corner, these are our standard ligatures where they're off. We have some weird awkwardness that's happening. The F and the I, for example, there's a separate dot. The F and the L, there's kind of a weird collision between the serifs there. And if we look at when we substitute the standard ligatures, the dot on the I goes away right there. The F and the L become one joint character. Notice also that the F or in this case the FF and the I, the crossbar actually crosses both of them. So these are things that you would do naturally in writing. It makes reading these a lot easier. When we get into the discretionary ligatures, this lower section here, these are a little bit, depends on the font. Would I combine the S and the T to have that little loop on it? Probably not. But a font designer might think that's important. These tend to happen a lot more if you use a font that has cursive lettering. And you've probably seen this happen before. You use one of those script fonts, and depending on which letters you combine together, they substitute these ligatures in to show how they combine together. It's like cursive. You know, you combine an R with an I, they combine in a certain way that's different than an R with some other letter. So you want to think about that. The good news about all those is they happen automatically if the font's good. So if you have a good high-quality font and you type TT, it will automatically substitute the two T's for you. Choosing the right font. This is probably the biggest challenge at your level of design. Anybody in 121 done a poster and had Daniel say, try it again? You chose the wrong font? Right? I see lots of nodding heads. This is very common because we need to choose the appropriate font for what we're trying to represent. It's absolutely critical. So what is the longevity of the piece? How long do you want this to last? How classic do you want it to be? What is the purpose of the piece? Is it innovative? Poor bird. He flew away, though, or she. Is it innovative or outdated? Is it traditional or too conservative? Okay, so you guys remember the movie Avatar? Right, it came out. Papyrus was the font. All right, big deal. So, oh, this is really cool. This is right? Trendy. So then you started to see it everywhere. All right, you started to see papyrus just all over the place. And guess what? Now, 10 years later, 5 years, whatever it was, 7 years, 10 years, something like that, later, this font's starting to look pretty dated. It's like, yeah, that was so mid-2000s. I used to pick older examples, and then I realized that you guys wouldn't remember any of those examples, so I tried to be a little bit more current. The point is that things can get overused. They can become dated. And you want to think about, is it appropriate on your lecture series poster to use papyrus as a font? Probably not. Right? Same thing happens when you turn in your poster as part of 121. If you use a serif font when you should have used the sans serif font, it just doesn't feel right with the modernist era. Those are things that are important to think about as you choose your font. Sometimes it's helpful to just combine or to show a particular document with different fonts side by side. And then you can kind of compare, does it read well? Does it attack the correct emotion? Do I want it coming after the correct emotion? Is it legible? Does it reflect the needs of the client or the viewer? Does it cause you to be interested in this particular piece or not? So here's an example. Very, very similar. Our headline is the same. And then we look side by side at the two fonts. On the surface, you do a quick look at this. They're very, very close. But my guess is that if you took a little bit more time, each of you would have an opinion as to which one is the better font, even though they're close. So how many people would say the left is the better font? How many people would say the right is the better font? There you go. So even though these are very similar in their look, there's one that appears better. And in this example, almost all of you picked the right. So if you were the graphic designer and you picked the left, would that be the right choice? Probably not. So you want to think about that as part of your design preferences. This one's just kind of a fun graphic. It's a play on the periodic table of elements. Same thing with typefaces. A lot of the big ones are here, and it's kind of fun to see how they all stack up next to each other. This one is actually one of my favorites, though. It's this, so you need a typeface. So in this case, we start, and I know the fonts are small for you guys to see up here, but we start and we say, oh, you know what? I want to do a logo. There's my logo. So I come down to the logo. Yeah, like I'm going to be able to read this. And do I want a serif or a sans serif? And depending on, oh, I want a sans serif. Do you like geometrics? No, right? I come over here, and see you follow through, and then all of a sudden you end up coming down here. Oh, there it is, myriad. That's the one I should choose. The entertaining thing, and I did not work with this when I was doing the book for this class, but if you follow through book and you actually answer all the questions that I would answer, you'd end up tracing right over here to Optima, which is the font that I use. So if I actually answer the questions honestly, I would end up in the font that I chose anyway. So it's kind of fun. Anyway, it's out there if you want to Google, so you need a typeface so you can actually look at this in higher resolution and see. I would do it. It's quite entertaining. So you've heard me already today talk about serif and sans serif fonts. And chances are if you're in 121, you've learned a lesson from Daniel about serif and sans serif fonts anyway. But serif and sans serif fonts have a specific purpose as part of the graphic design world. Serif here refers to, oops, hold on. I'm drawing without being able to draw. There we go. Serif refers to these little tails that occur as part of the letter forms. So at the top of the S, there's a little tail. The I has a little tail. All those little tails happen. That is referred to as a serif. So it's a serif font. A sans serif, sans without serif, we get no tails on the tops of the S. We get no tails on the I. There's the bottom of the F. And so you guys say, well, why is this, does this make any difference? Well, the truth is it makes a huge difference for reading. If you pick up any magazine or any book, they will all be serif fonts because of how easy it is to read. We recognize the letters far better when they have the little tails on them. The sans serif tends to be a little bit cleaner. You'll read this more commonly in a blog or at a computer format. The font tends to have to be a little bit bigger to read, and you'll see this when you're reading on your phones or on the computer. If they're using a sans serif font, it tends to be a little bit bigger. If we're in print form, not that anybody actually reads a print magazine anymore, but let's say you did, right? If you picked up that print magazine, you're trying to cram a lot of information into a small page format. You want the font to be small. It's much easier to read with a serif on it. Combining typefaces. So as graphic designers, it's always fun to try to combine different typefaces together. The easiest thing is to stick within one typeface and just vary from light to bold. If you vary from light to bold, italic, non-italic, etc., you'll end up having no problems with the fonts combining together. If we extend to multiple typefaces, you have to pay a little bit more attention. Obviously, it gives you far more possibilities for how things come together, but you have to pay more attention for how they combine. And if they're going to combine, they need to have similar cap heights and X heights. Otherwise, they won't feel right when you put them together. So in this case, I have a couple different examples. Sabon and Syntax, Meriden and Frutiger. The X heights are the same in those letters. The cap heights are the same. Therefore, we can combine them together. The other thing that's critical is that we combine a serif and a sans serif font, rather than two serif fonts or two sans serif fonts. If we were combining two sans serif fonts, for example, they're going to compete with each other. They're too close. Serif and a sans serif, one has tails, one doesn't. They're going to naturally go together a little bit better. So here we go, examples. Right? We're using embrace diversity several different times. The X heights are always the same as we compare them. We could draw a line right here. There's our X height. Line right here. There's our X height. If we were to scramble these, the X heights would be different and they wouldn't feel right. So we're really trying to make sure that those are consistent. We can also use display and script fonts. These work great for headings, bold, titles, that sort of thing. If you were to take your English paper or your history paper and write it in a script font and hand it in to your English teacher, they would shoot you because it's not appropriate. If the title or the heading had script in it, not that this does, but if architecture was in script form, that would be okay. It's designed to grab your attention. That's fine. But we're not going to use it for a big paragraph. So when we start to design with type, we have to think about several different factors in this. We have to think about legibility and readability. If these two aren't met, nobody's going to want to read whatever it is that you designed. They're not going to work with whatever you design. It's essential for good communication. Legibility refers to the recognition of individual letters, and readability is how the typography as a whole is presented in terms of lines, pictures, and paragraphs. So we want both legibility, individual letter forms, and readability, how it flows as a paragraph or as a sentence. So here are some examples. We have legibility. On the left, Arial seems easy enough to understand. Mesquite, which will work great for, say, a big, bold headline, charcoal briquettes on a package or something. Not that anybody buys those anymore. But it's a lot harder to read in a paragraph format. Readability. You want to use a type that's comfortable, right? Letter Gothic, on the other hand, is a sans serif font. It's harder to read. And you can just see this as you scan through. One's easier to read than the other. Impact works for a headline, not so good for a paragraph. Times New Roman is great for newspaper, finance, something like that. Comic Sans, great if you're like a second grade teacher. So you want to think about what's it useful for and what's appropriate. We have two different formats of representation. We have practical and straightforward objective representation. It's clear, it's ordered, it contains a strong hierarchy. That would work really well for something like a poster. Subjective representation, this is usually a little bit more artistic. We're combining different fonts. It's more of a piece of art. It's conceptual and interpretive. It's heavily focused on a particular theme. It can work just as well for a poster, but it takes a little bit more practice to make it work nicely. We want to think about both micro and macro perspectives. Macro perspectives are the big scale stuff. How does your font choice and your text fit into the overall design? Does it fit within the framework and the vocabulary that you've established as part of your design? This is the typographic hierarchy, and we'll emphasize this a lot next lecture, and that is that do we have item 1, subheading, item 2, body, right? Do we work our way down in a hierarchy so that it's clear what's on top and what comes later? Or is it jumbled? And we want to think about it. Micro perspective are the small details. And it would be unreasonable to think about the small details in between every letter of your 10,000-word English essay. You're not going to go and look at this. However, when we do posters, when we do graphic design pieces, typically the text isn't overwhelming. It's not a book. It's one page. And at that level, we really want to go through and think about all of those small details, how they come together, and how they showcase the overall piece so that there's no mistakes. And we'll talk about what those small details are a little bit later. This is, I think, in German. I have no idea. But type-wise, it's working really nicely together. It does look better on the actual slide. Symmetry and asymmetry. Symmetrical, this works just like the compositional technique that we talked about in the world of Photoshop. And that is that we have something that's symmetrical. One side of the page balances the other side of the page. One half of the page balances the other half. Asymmetrical, one half is weighted differently than the other half. And depending on what you're designing, it can be a benefit or it cannot. Alignment, the horizontal and vertical position of the typography within the margins. Alignment creates the visual relationship between the elements of design. So how we put the text in context makes a big difference. We'll talk about this a lot more in next class's lecture. We'll talk about type as just one element, including photos and all the rest of those, and those are other elements and how they combine together. Typographic color is also important. It's easy to think of type as just text. Oh, I just have some text, we'll throw it on there. But really, it provides a graphic element just like a photograph. So if you were all to squint at this, doesn't matter what it says, you can pick out that certain paragraphs are darker or lighter than other paragraphs. that relative darkness or lightness is going to form a shape that then contrasts with the other shapes in your graphic design. Is it dark enough to work with those other shapes? Does it feel right? Those are things that are important. So that's typographic color. Type size, you've all done this. You all know what a 12-point font is. You all know that if you bump your font to 13-point, you get a little bit extra space. You also know that if you drop it to 10-point, you get a little bit more space. The changes in type size result in a hierarchy of elements. This is the most easy way of adjusting or establishing a hierarchy for your particular project, website, poster, etc. Heading, 16 points. Subheading, 13 points. Body paragraph, 10 points. Right? You establish a font weight or a font size hierarchy. It's really easy to see. If you have a proportionate scale of sizes, that hierarchy is very, very obvious. Case is also important. If we're reading a lot, lowercase letters are far more readable than uppercase letters. Uppercase letters emphasize letter-to-letter recognition. The cap heights are all the same. We have to concentrate and read each letter to understand what the word is. So there's a reason that architectural designers write in all capitals. It's because we want what we're saying to be important. We want you to concentrate and see what we're saying and actually read it. We don't write lots. That's the great thing about architecture or design as a field. We don't have to write giant papers for the most part, except for history class. Right? We get to design stuff. We get to draw stuff. We communicate through our drawings, and we use text when it's appropriate and only when it's appropriate. And because we use it sparingly, letter-to-letter recognition, or all capitals, makes a lot of sense. If you turned in your English paper in all capitals, they wouldn't like it very much because it's much harder to read. So, for example, it doesn't matter in what order the letters in a word appear. This is pretty hard to read, right? Try this one. For example, it doesn't matter in what order the letters in a word appear. The only important thing is that the first and last letter are in the right place. Much easier to read, isn't it? So if we contrast that, letter-to-letter recognition. We have to think about what all the letters are in order to actually read this paragraph. This is a whole lot easier because it's lowercase letters and we recognize the forms. Kind of fun. Kerning is adjusting the spacing between individual letters. You're not going to do kerning on an entire English paper. You're not going to go through each letter and make adjustments. You are, however, in a title or in a poster or in a book, you know, the cover of a book or something, you're going to work on kerning to correct problems. So there are inherently problems with some letters. TY, VA, those kinds of letters are typical problems. If we look here, that's the default spacing. The Y and the end of the T are roughly in line. If we were naturally writing TY, we would stick the Y under the T, naturally. So when we're working in our font format, we want to do the same thing. The Y gets shifted over to be under the T. Likewise, in capital letters, we have a similar problem. The spacing between those is awkward. So we space it out a little bit more to make the spacing feel even there and there. So it's individual letter spacing is the kerning. Tracking, on the other hand, adjusts the spacing between words, lines, and paragraphs. So you guys all have increased the font size, or I shouldn't say all of you. A lot of you have increased the font size to make your English paper appear a little bit longer, etc. Don't do that anymore. You're far more sophisticated now. You just adjust the tracking and make it longer. Far better strategy. Spacing between words, lines, and paragraphs, not between individual letters. It can greatly improve readability. If something is feeling like it's not flowing correctly, you increase the tracking. It becomes a little bit easier to read. Likewise, if things appear too spaced out, you decrease the tracking. They get a little closer together and easier to read. It does influence the typographic color. We talked about that relative gray value of the paragraph of text. The denser the text is, the darker it becomes. You don't track lowercase letters. So this is not about in-between letters. It's about words, paragraphs, etc. Leading refers to space between lines of text. So in Word, we just, I'm going to do 1.5 or double space. Right? Well, that's not really what it is. It's a shortcut method. Leading has to do with the lines of text measured from one baseline to the next. So how many points is from one baseline of text to the other baseline of text? So for example, you have a 12-point font. If you had a 12-point leading, the bottom baseline would match up with the top of the next line. So there wouldn't be any space between the two. Typically, a standard spacing of a 12-point would be like a 14.2 point. So we have a little bit more space above the text. If you wanted it to be more spread out, you'd increase that. And I'll show you today in InDesign where you make these adjustments. Tall X heights or heavy typefaces or sans serif. Remember we talked about serif and sans serif. Sans serif is harder to read. Therefore, you need more space between your lines. Bunch of examples of just really good typography. Good, clean, well-established, that has no text on it. Notice the ligature on this. The two T's combined together, one crossbar. Those little details are absolutely critical. These are too hard to see. They look a lot better here. Sorry about that. OK, so we're going to take a quick break. Let's come back at 9, and we'll work through InDesign. And I'll talk through typography in the world of InDesign. OK, so we're going to continue with InDesign today, talking about text and kind of how you work with text. And of course, I just lectured on typography. I think it's important, etc. But when it comes to InDesign, I think it's important to take type as its own separate day. So all we're dealing with today is type. If you decide you want to insert images as part of your text, that's fine. But really, this is about fonts, font choice, type, etc. So I'm going to go ahead and open up InDesign. And I didn't have a problem with it today, but go figure, right? It opened up just fine. And when I get to the splash screen, I'm going to go ahead and say a new document. And the document I'm going to pick is just a letter size. And for what we're doing today, there's actually two parts to it. The first part is just a simple letter size document. I'll go ahead and say OK. And that gives me my standard 8.5 by 11 inch piece of paper. Remember that the default units are in picas, which again don't mean much to me. So if I right-click on the little crossbar of the two rulers, I can switch from picas into inches, and that seems a lot better. I see 8.5 by 11 now, and it starts to feel a little bit more real. By default, there were margins set at a 1/2 inch around the page. Those are completely arbitrary. They have nothing to do with what's going to be clipped by the printer. They have nothing to do with anything. It's just what InDesign sets as the default. If I want to change them, I can go up to the Layout menu and go to Margins and Columns. And from here, I can choose what those are. And you can see that they're all set at a 1/2 inch. I could set them all to 0 because I don't really need them right now. And you see that they jump. If, for example, I set them to 1, you get what a typical document might be in Word. You can also unchain the margins and set the top at 1.5 inches and have it different than the other margins if you wanted to. But again, this is just completely arbitrary. It's something that you're setting on your own if you want them to be set. Typically, when I'm working, I set them to 0 to get them out of the way because I don't need to see them. I'll establish whatever my own guidelines are when that point comes. So I'll go ahead and say OK. And now we're going to start working with text. And one of the important things to understand is that, remember, generation of content, meaning creating a photo, creating a text document, shouldn't happen in the world of InDesign. So just like we worked on bringing in photos by placing photos, we would like, ideally, to do the same thing with text. So InDesign recognizes things like Word files with text in them. And we can use that as part of our overall strategy. So on the course website, under today's exercise here, if you go down to the bottom, under the download section, the first item is a Word document that you can download. If you click on it, it will download that Word document, and you can then save that onto your flash drive. I've already done it. What this Word document is, if I open up Word, is the first chapter of Vitruvius's 10 books on architecture. So it's essentially some text. And we're going to use it to learn the text process as part of InDesign so that you don't actually have to write anything today, which is important. So I have that. I opened it up just so you could see it, but I'm going to go ahead and close it. Now that it's closed, I'm going to go back to the world of InDesign, and I'm going to create my first text box. So let's go ahead and start with the T tool up here. And with that T tool, I'm going to create my first text box. So let's say we'll start here. And we'll go to about there. And I'll shorten that up a little bit. We'll go to right there. So when I create that text box, you see that I get a cursor inside the text box. And of course, I could start typing whatever it is that I wanted to type. Remember, though, that InDesign isn't about creating content. You're not going to sit down and write your English paper in InDesign. That's not the purpose of it. You're not going to write your history paper in InDesign. It's for the layout work. So I'll go ahead and click on the black arrow and then select just my text box. So yes, this doesn't have the X in it that works like a frame, but it essentially is a box that can hold content. So with that selected, I can go up to the File menu, and just like I did with my frame with an image, I can go to File and then Place. And then I can choose that Word document. So let me come back here, and this should be right there. There's that Word document, the first chapter. I'll go ahead and click on Open, and you'll see that the text fills into that box for me. It brings up something else here, and part of the reason that I like this Word document and I give it to you as a sample is because it has a problem, and that is that the font that's in the Word document doesn't match with one that's on this system. So this is something that you can that will happen to you occasionally, and that is that it's looking for Times Roman bold and Times Roman regular. I don't have either of those two fonts. I have Times New Roman on this computer. And part of the problem here is I created this on my Mac versus on Windows, and so you're going to end up with these problems. When you have a problem, it will highlight the text in pink, and it then substitutes a different font for it. So this is not the font that it's supposed to be. If I click on Find Font, there it is, Times Roman and Times Roman bold. I can click on Times Roman, and I can say Replace with, and we could pick Times New Roman. And I could say Change All. And then I could come back to Times Roman bold, Times New Roman, font style bold. Remember, we're picking the font style from within the font family here. And then I'll go ahead and say Change All. And now you see that the pink goes away. And the reason that the pink went away is because it now has the correct font assigned to it. The other option would be to just select all the font and then replace it with some other font. And we're going to do that shortly. So the text that I put in is obviously the whole first chapter of Vitruvius's 10 books on architecture, which is way more text that can actually fit in this one column that I have set up here. Notice down at the bottom of my text box, I end up with a little plus sign. It's a red plus sign. That means that there is more text or overset text on the page. There's stuff that isn't included. So if I continued and I clicked the text box again and I created another column, say like that, I can then take the text from this and flow it into the next text box. So I can do that by clicking on the little plus. And when I click on that little plus, you see that it loads up my cursor with a preview of more text and a little chain link icon, I can then chain that to this, and it will continue to flow into this text box. And so you guys are thinking in your heads, oh, that's kind of nifty. The cool thing about this is we can take it a step further. If we decide, I didn't like those two columns, let me change and drag that down. Notice the text continues to just go off the page. Oh, wait, let me adjust this one to right there, and it adjusts the flow into this text box. So no matter how I adjust these text boxes, they're chained together such that the text will always flow between the boxes, no matter what I do. So this is a very, very handy tool for creating large book-like English papers, etc., because we can chain the text back and forth through a particular object. Furthermore, we could take this and adjust it so that it went from page to page on multiple pages. So we can continue chaining through multiple pages. The other thing that we can do is we could go back and edit our original Word file. Say we caught some corrections or we wanted to change it, and then we could replace the text, and the replaced text would then go all the way through the document. So the layout itself stays independent of the content, which is really, really important. OK, so now I've established that I have these two columns here. Actually, maybe instead I want the title to be its own separate thing up at the top. Let's move this one over. And let me create one more text box. Like that. And I'll come back and I'll flow the text into this text box. Oops. There we go. I'll flow it into that text box. Make a few adjustments. Now let's make those a little closer together. Anyway, you get the idea. So as I make this a little bit bigger, I can get more text into that upper box. Maybe these guys need to go down a little bit more. There you go. See how they're automatically flowing through the boxes. So now, as I start to adjust things, maybe I want to take this chapter 1 and I want to make it a different font. So I can do that in a couple different ways. The simplest way is to double-click to get inside the text box, select the text, and then come up to the font menu, and we could change the font to be something else. So let's say that I wanted it to be a script font. That's awful. Let's try something else. There we go. OK, and I'm not trying to say that these are the most attractive things in the world. I'm just showing you how I can go about doing it. Furthermore, I could take my text and I could change the point size right here. It's at 16 point right now. Right? I could make it 36 point if I wanted to. Below that point size, I have my it's my leading, which is the space between baselines. So right now it's automatically generated. That's why it's in parentheses. I have 36 point font. It's 43.2 point leading. If I were to change this, for example, to 36, the text below would match up. It's a little hard because I need more space here. So you can see this. Hold on a second. Let me drop this down. So you can see the changes here. OK, so let me come back here at 36 point. If I had another 36 point text, if this was 36 point, for example, they'd be right on top of each other. There, they're getting closer. The fonts aren't the same. So anyway, the point is that I can change the spacing. It's probably more noticeable if I came down here in the paragraph there, and I changed. Right now it's at 16 point. Right, let's change the font first to be 12 point. And then let's change the spacing. If I went to 48 point, you can see that the spacing goes much bigger. Likewise, if I went down to, in this case, 9 point, let me zoom in a little bit. You can see that the text is starting to overlap itself. So 12 point would be exactly even. There it is. So you can see right there between the P and the F that there's just a tiny bit of space between the two of them. So that would be about as small as I would want to get. Generally speaking, leave it at auto, and you'll get spacing that's readable. OK, so let me zoom back a little there. Oops. There we go. And then I can continue making adjustments. So here's chapter 1. Right? We talked about being able to adjust the kerning, or the spacing between individual letters. I can move my cursor between these letters. We can get to the kerning right here, and I can adjust the spacing between these letters to make it more readable. Right, those need a little bit more space. And there'll be some happy medium of what the right spacing between the letter is to where it actually looks the way it should. Okay, and again, this is a visual adjustment. I do have some other options. Right? I could take this particular piece. I could choose to make it a superscript if I wanted, where it goes up, like an exponent or something. I don't want it there. I could also choose to underline this, like that, for example. And so I could do a strike through. So there's different options that are available there. We'll get to tracking when we get to an actual paragraph. I can also control the overall height percentage of a particular letter. So for example, I could take the C here, and I could increase the height of that particular letter. And it's getting taller. I don't know that you would necessarily want to do that. I'm just showing you that it's possible. We could also increase the width of a particular letter so that it ends up being a fatter letter. Again, not sure that that's relevant. We could manually italicize something by selecting the letter or the word, and then we could specify a degree, 30 degrees, and it slants the letters over. Again, better to pick the actual italicized version from the font list, should you want that. As we continue over, we have other things that are relevant to the paragraph. So for example, if I were to select this paragraph, I can control that it's ragged on the right. I could justify so that the whole paragraph is consistent, which changes the spacing of the paragraph. I could center the paragraph. I could make it right justified, etc. So these kinds of things should make some sense to you. You're used to seeing it in Word. I have those options available as well. I have more custom options here where I could choose to indent the whole paragraph by a certain amount. I could choose to indent the first line. Notice that I could also negatively indent the first line, so it went backwards, so that the bulk of the paragraph is over except for the first number there. We could indent the last line if we wanted to. I've never seen a use for that. We can also control the spacing between paragraphs at the start or at the end. So right now there's a spacing at the end of the paragraph. We could get that spacing down. Likewise, between these, I'm betting that there's spacing. Yep, there's spacing between the paragraph. And we could get those down as well. Obviously, I don't want that to be included. I want it to be down there. So we have flexibility in those decisions as well. We can also create a drop cap, which is essentially causing the first letter or two to be bigger than the other letters. So let me go back here. We could have the 1 be bigger, for example. And that drop cap is designed so that even if you were inline in text, something like this, here we go. Let me drop cap that. We'll say 2 letters, and I can then choose how many lines I want it to be, like that. You see this in like old English writings where the first letter is bigger than the other letters. So all of that's great, and I can go through and I can create any one of these by manually selecting, if I wanted to emphasize a particular word. So for example, drawing right there, I could go through and select drawing and then make it bold or whatever it is that I wanted to do. The thing about it is if we get a really long, big document, you don't want to have to go through and remember, oh, I want this to be bold and I want that to be bold. Instead, we can set up two different things. One is called a paragraph style, and the other is called a character style. And what the paragraph and character styles do is that they allow us to, independent of the actual word or text, set up a profile for reuse. So then all the bolded words would use a particular character style. We'd apply the character style, and we can edit the style independent of which words are selected with it, if that makes sense. So I'll show you this in a second. So let's start with a paragraph style. I'm going to click on paragraph styles. I'm going to create a new paragraph style. If you're not seeing it on the right here, switch either to typography or advanced. Typography is what we're doing, so it's probably best to have typography showing. And I will then work with the paragraph style. So right here under paragraph style, I'm going to create a new paragraph style. It's called paragraph style 1. And let's call this body for right now. And then under the body style, if I double click on it, it will take me to the paragraph style options dialog box. And so in here, I have basic things that can be adjusted. The first thing is basic character formats. I would encourage you not to adjust these and instead apply a character format or a character style rather than doing it by paragraph. It's a little bit easier if you keep the two separate. But I do have the option to choose fonts and stuff, etc. But remember, this is about a paragraph, not about the font or the character itself. As I come down here, we can get to indents and spacing. So this is where I'm controlling what my overall indent would be. So in this case, I have a left indent, or I have a left alignment. I have no indent. I have no first line indent. So that's fine. We're good here. But I can also control my space before and space after. Let's set my space after to be a 1/2 inch. And I'll go ahead with that and continue on down. Tabs I'm not going to worry about. Paragraph rules, if I wanted a particular rule, I could apply it here. I can choose to hyphenate my words or not. I'm going to go ahead and hyphenate them here. We'll keep coming down. Under drop caps and nested styles, this is where you'd add that too. I'll come back and edit this later and show you how it applies. Okay? We can also do bullets and numbering. So if I wanted a bulleted list, for example, I can do that, and I can control my alignment and where the bullets would occur. For this, I don't want a bulleted list, so I'm going to leave it at none. And the rest of these, I'm just going to leave as their defaults. I'll go ahead and say OK. And I now have a style called body. And I can pick a particular paragraph and apply the body style to it. And you see here that it's hyphenated versus the one that's non-hyphenated. So here I am in paragraph 2. If I switch to the body style, it matches up exactly. I've got hyphenations, etc. So for example, let me select all my paragraphs. Let me say this all the way to 4. Those are the ones that I can see. Let me apply the body to all of them. So I now have the body style applied to all of those. If I edit the style, so for example, if I double click on it and I go into hyphenation and I say, you know what, I don't like it hyphenated, let me turn it off and say OK, it will apply to every paragraph, the change. So I no longer have to select the text because I already have a style applied to it. So if I double click and I say, you know, I don't like how much space is after the paragraph, I can come down here to my where am I? Indents and spacing. And I can say, you know what, I'd rather have 1/4 inch between each paragraph. And then it changes so that they're all adjusted. So that's the power of using a style versus manually selecting a given paragraph. I could also go in and I could say, you know what, I did like those drop caps. Let me come back to drop caps. Let's do 2 lines with 2 characters. And I'll say OK. And all of the paragraphs will then have that applied to it. So the style is a very, very powerful thing to set up. So let's create, instead of a style this time, let's come down to character styles. And I'm going to create a character style for the bold word. And so here, we'll go ahead and create a new character style. And I'm going to call this character style bold word, for lack of something better. And then under basic character formats, I want my font style to be set as bold. I can choose a font family too. We'll come back and make that edit a little bit later on. And then we can continue through the rest of the things. And I'll do this in just a second. So I now have my bold word character style. Let's make sure knowledge gets set to bold word. Manual skill gets set to bold word. Scholarship gets set to bold word. Okay, so all three of those are set. Now that they're all set, I can make adjustments. So let me come back to bold word, and let's say, you know what, I really would rather have it in a different font. So I could switch to a different font, and when I say OK, the font will change. See how it changes in all of them? So this is a very powerful way of making these kinds of adjustments. So you know what, I didn't like that font. Let me come back and I'll pick something else, and we'll see what that one looks like. Okay, so be it. I could also say, you know what, I'd like my color of my word to be something different. So let's make the color of the word red. Right, now that word shows up as red because it has that character style applied to it. I could create a character style for these numbers. I could create a new character style. Let's call this numbers. Basic character formats, font family. This is where a script one would be nice. Let's try freestyle script. And I'll go ahead and say OK. And now for each of these numbers, I could apply the numbers character style, and that would change. The advantage, again, is that I can come back if I didn't like freestyle script, and I could change it to a different script font. Let's try French script. I'll say OK, and now that's different. I could also adjust the size. So if I wanted the type to be a different size, I could do that as well. Right? Maybe the bold word here, I wanted it to be 14 point. When I do that, that changes as well. So the point is that I can make adjustments independent of the text itself once the character and paragraph styles have been applied. So I want you to play around with this first chapter. You only have to do one page. I do want to point out one other thing, though it's a little bit more advanced, and that is that if I place an image, which is not required as part of today, if I place an image, I go to File, Place. I have no images in here, so I'm just going to use one from last. We used the fireworks from last class. There it is. I can choose to flow text around the image. So if I select the text box that's near the image, and I go to Text Wrap on the right here, I can choose to flow around. Oh, excuse me. It's the image that I have selected, and I can choose to flow around the particular image. So if anybody's ever done a history paper or something where you have images in it in Word, and you've tried to put more than one image in a page at the same time in Word, you notice that it really hates you. Right? InDesign, I can do as many as I want, and I can flow around it without any problem. So it's really good for those kinds of things. Anyway, today it's not critical that you place that. I just wanted to at least show you that that is an option, and it's available for you as well. You only need to do one page. So even though that this continues on beyond the pages that it would take multiple pages, you only have to do the first page. I want you to set up a paragraph and a character style and explore how those two things change. So make some edits to them as well. When you're done with this, you're going to do let me make sure I match it up with what I say here. You don't even have to post this one. When you're done with this, I want you to do a word art that reflects yourself. So if you do an image search to get some examples, and you type in word art, you can see lots of examples. So it's something like this. Right? I'm not asking you to do something like this. It's a little intense. Right? But something, it could be a free-form blob of some kind that represents who you are. You're going to have to create lots of different texts. You're going to have to place in lots of different fonts and that sort of thing. This will get you very used to how text works. And so you can see there's lots of different examples of word art as you go through. You're going to do something along those lines. That will then be what you turn in for today. Okay, so the Vitruvius part is just about getting familiar with text. Then you'll create a little piece of word art, and that's what you'll post. When you're done, do make sure you save both as an InDesign file. So you go to File, Save As, and make sure it's an InDesign CS6 document, and you'll save that. And also do a File, Export, and you're going to choose JPEG as the Save As type, and then click Save. When you do that, it's going to ask you your size. Quality should be maximum. Resolution should be 300. And you'll go ahead and click on Export. You'll post the this JPEG version as your featured image for your post today. It'll be the word art one, not this one. And that'll count for your post for today. Are there any questions? Nope. All right.